We've all heard the narrative. Apple is too big. Amazon is too big. Google is too big. It seems like these tech giants have formed unbreakable monopolies around various segments of the market and that they're quote-unquote too big to fail. But if history has taught us anything, it's that no company is too big to fail. Sure, the government and stockholders can bail out a failing company and give it another 10, 20, 30 years of lifetime. But you can only do this for so long, and eventually, these companies will fail as well. Just take a look at the biggest companies throughout history. Sears, Roebuck & Co., for example, is often credited with inventing the department store. And throughout the 1900s, they were the biggest retailer in the entire world. Yet, in 2018, Sears filed for bankruptcy and shut down all of their stores. Similarly, Chrysler and General Motors were two of the biggest names in the automotive industry throughout the 1900s. Yet, in the late 2000s, both of them filed for bankruptcy. Now, of course, these guys got bailed out because they were integral to the automotive industry in the late 2000s. But do you think they'll be bailed out again if they miss out on the EV transition? If there's a handful of EV companies like Tesla, Rivian, and maybe even Ford overshadowing them, I don't think they'll be bailed out. Also, if these companies were truly too big to fail, they would have never needed a bailout in the first place. So clearly, all companies come and go, but how does a company go from being an unstoppable force in the market to eventually being forgotten about? The first struggle that every large corporation has to deal with is the pains of scale. We always hear about economies of scale, and I'm sure you guys know exactly what this is. Economies of scale is a cost advantage that large companies enjoy due to serving a large market. Pains of scale, or diseconomies of scale on the other hand, are a cost disadvantage that comes along with being too big. You see, small companies don't have human resources or fancy corporate events, and they don't fly around executives and directors around the world. Their employees also don't spend hours every day answering emails or participating in meetings. In other words, smaller companies generally have little to no operational expenses. YouTubers are a great example of this. While there are some creators like Mr. Beast and Good Mythical Morning with massive teams and production expenses behind them, most creators have extremely small operational expenses. PewDiePie, Sniper Wolf, AthleanX, Graham Stephan, Andre Jig, and Mark Rober are all basically just one-man shows. Sure, they may have a few employees that help them edit and make sponsorship deals and so on, but compared to their income, the amount they spend on payroll is extremely small. Not to mention, most of these guys just record in their bedroom or a small set inside their house. So if they have a bad month in terms of views, it doesn't really matter. They won't make as much money, but they're also not in any risk of losing money. The same, however, cannot be said about a channel like the Infographic Show. If you were to replicate one of their videos using professional talent, it'll easily cost you $10,000 per video. But I'm sure they have insane economies of scale. Maybe their cost per video is only $3,000. But to get to that number, they had to take on a boatload of fixed expenses. In the last month, for example, the Infographic Show posted 42 videos. And even if each video only cost them $3,000, we're talking about a fixed cost of about $126,000 per month. Given how many views the Infographic Show gets every month, I'm sure they pull in way more than this in terms of revenue. But with that being said, their operational expenses are a much bigger percentage of their revenue than someone like Andre Jig. This means that it would be significantly easier for Andre to weather a 50% downturn than it would be for the Infographic Show. This same principle also applies to the biggest companies in the world. Regardless of how the next iPhone performs, Apple has to pay tens of millions to keep the UFO in California alive. They have to pay for tens of thousands of man-hours spent in meetings and answering emails. And they have to pay large salaries to thousands of managers and directors that a small corporation simply wouldn't need. While these may seem like negligible expenses compared to Apple's profits, the thing to note is that all these factors create friction. And this friction makes Apple slower and slower, which gives up-and-coming competitors the perfect opportunity to overtake them. Aside from being a slower behemoth, larger companies usually fall into the trap of prioritizing profits over innovation. This isn't always the company's fault per se. The problem is often that they've simply hit a dead end within their industry. I mean, honestly, how much better can you make an iPhone or a MacBook? Really, all that's left is consistently improving the speed and reliability of these devices year after year. And as each generational jump becomes a smaller and smaller difference, people upgrade less often, which forces these companies to look for alternative modes of revenue to continue growth. Now, Apple has done a phenomenal job with all of their services, whether that be iCloud or Apple Music, but none of these are new inventions or are particularly innovative. The same thing can be said about Amazon. A lot of logistics innovation had to be done to get delivery timeframes down from 1 week to 2 days to next day to same day to 1 hour delivery. But how much more could Amazon really push this, and how much more would consumers even care about said improvement? The truth is that Apple has solved the smartphone problem, and Amazon has solved the logistics problem. The only step left is to refine and maintain as long as possible. But the problem is that the top talent is not interested in refining and maintaining. Do you really think the top engineers are interested in making the iPhone notch smaller or removing the camera bump? No, the top engineers are interested in developing artificial intelligence, leveraging machine learning, programming self-driving cars, creating the metaverse, launching rockets, and so on and so forth. So, as larger companies start to prioritize profits over innovation, the top talent will slowly bleed into up-and-coming companies. In the meantime, the largest companies are left with MBA businessmen who are generally more interested in progressing themselves than progressing the company. Now, I'm not faulting these guys for prioritizing self-preservation over pushing forward the company. But whether their reasoning is justified or not, in the end, the company is hurt, and this leads to an extremely dangerous negative feedback loop. As employees care less and less about the future of the company, their products become less and less inspiring, which attracts worse and worse talent, which then makes their products even less inspiring. If this sustains for long enough, you'll end up like JCPenney, Wells Fargo, AT&T, Dish, GE, etc. If we're being honest, none of the employees at these companies give a crap about the future of the company. They're all there for one reason and one reason only, a paycheck. And when a company gets to this point, it's all but over. When all the innovation within an industry is gone, what follows next is always a race to the bottom. In the automotive industry, for example, once most of the innovation was done, Toyota and Honda stepped in and made cars cheaper and more affordable than ever before. Similarly, once the Airline Deregulation Act of 1978 passed, airline ticket prices fell off a cliff. This is quite natural. As innovation slows down, a given product or service loses much of its appeal, and companies' fan bases dissipate. This isn't to say that people no longer use said product or service, but simply that they no longer take pride in a certain brand. For example, in the late 1800s, a wealthy gentleman may have been proud to get their electricity from the best provider in the nation. Today, electricity is used more than ever before, but no one gives a crap about who their electricity provider is. Electricity is just a part of daily life, and people choose a provider based on who is the cheapest, not what brand it's from. Similarly, when was the last time you cared about where your gas comes from or where your steel comes from? Even if you do care about these factors, it's likely because you care about the product itself as opposed to the company. Maybe you only buy your steel and gas from one company because you need a certain quality of steel or you want the highest quality of gas. But in these scenarios, you're not loyal to the brand, you're loyal to the product. If a new gas company came out tomorrow and offered a better quality of gas for the same price, you'd likely switch in a heartbeat. Clearly, the same thing cannot be said about iPhones and Androids or macOS and Windows right now. These inventions are still rather new, and people are still extremely divided on these subjects. But with time, people will care less and less as these products basically become the same thing. Something else to note is that many of these companies have already experienced this in the past. Apple, for example, nearly went bankrupt in the late 1990s after the initial PC boom came to an end and budget options flooded the market. They had to pivot to the mobile market to reignite growth. Similarly, Microsoft had a decade of stagnation after 2000 as they had already won the PC market. It wasn't until Microsoft embraced the cloud and servers that they started to grow once again. If Microsoft and Apple hadn't made these shifts, it's likely that they would have already gone bankrupt or ended up like IBM. I know a lot of people would like to see Amazon go bankrupt, but what's ironic is that the person who is most confident that Amazon will go bankrupt is Jeff Bezos. In 2018, Jeff said, quote, "Amazon is not too big to fail. In fact, I predict one day Amazon will fail. Amazon will go bankrupt. If you look at large companies, their lifespans tend to be 30 plus years, not 100 plus years. And if we think about it, many of the big tech companies that people complain about aren't even 30 years old. Amazon, Google, Tesla, Nvidia, and Facebook are all less than 30 years old. The two big tech companies that are older than that are Apple and Microsoft. And as we previously touched on, the only reason these guys are still crushing it is because they basically became a new business right around that 30-year mark. Meanwhile, Amazon and Google are fast approaching that 30-year mark. And likewise, they've basically reached market saturation in their main industries, and they're facing more backlash than ever before. Similarly, Facebook may be the most hated company in the world, and they haven't even been around for 20 years. This isn't to say that any of these companies are gonna collapse anytime soon, but this next decade could very well be the largest and most dominant that you'll ever see them. After all, it's just a matter of time until a company's friction builds up, they start to prioritize profits over innovation, they lose their top talent, cheaper alternatives enter the market, the customer base dissipates, and the company becomes a shell of their former self. And I think Jeff Bezos says it best.
Companies have short lifespans, Charlie, and Amazon will be disrupted one day.
And you worry about that?
I don't worry about it because I know it's inevitable. Companies come and go. And the companies that are the shiniest and most important of any era, you wait a few decades and they're gone.
And your job is to make sure that you delay that date.
I would love for it to be after I'm dead.
When do you guys think Apple will file for bankruptcy? Comment that down below. Also, drop a like if you hate bailouts. And of course, consider checking out our international channels to watch our videos in other languages, and consider subscribing to see more questions logically answered. But until then, I'm Hari, and I'll see you guys on the next one.